all the patterns were in great big ledgers. And when you were learning, I mean, you couldn't disturb the other girls because they were quite complicated. And so you'd have to go to the office and look for this pattern and bring this big book up to your bench and sit with it on your bench, you know. And that was the way you learned. And you had to learn them because you couldn't do that all the time. It was as though they were imprinted on your memory, and you just learned which leaf was one green and which, because you could have 3 or 4 different greens, and they all had to go in the right place.
It was in Woodwell again, and you got these crates, and you used to have to lean over and just put the cups and saucers in the Woodwell and wrap them up in the Woodwell and put them in. All the dust was, and everything was going in. Oh, it was horrible. And it was hard work. And I used to have to try and pick the crate up and put it on a stillage. And you used to have to do that about 3 crates high. And it was too hard, too heavy.
I started off in the dipping house, and those days you didn't just start off in like a specific job. You started at the bottom of the ladder, sort of fetching the ware for the actual dippers and putting it up for them to work with. Then you progressed to what we call taking off, which is the dipper would put the stuff, dip the actual ware, put it onto a grid to drain, and then you would pick it up and put it onto the dryer, which was mainly what we call dollarware, the cups, teapots, jugs, things like that. The flat was plates and muffins and things like that were put straight onto the dryer by the dipper. And then after a while, if the head dipper sort of liked your face, he would give you, if you were a bit slack, he would give you an hour in give you an hour in the tub, let you have a try out with dipping the ware. And you progress and progress, and you went from putter up to taker off, from taker off to part-time dipper, to apprentice dipper, and then you went to journeyman. Now, you'd got to be 21 to be a journeyman. You had to do at least 5 years apprenticeship so that you can be a journeyman dipper. I mean, things have changed now. They just do it. If you show a fair amount of intelligence, you know, you can go straight into teaching you how to dip. But it was a good grounding, because at least you knew what happened in a dipping house, you know. Putting up is just, as I say, more or less labouring, fetching the ware and putting it onto this like a wooden stage by the side of the dipping tubs, so that the dipper could pick it up and dip it. The taker off worked stood alongside the dipper, and this involved dipping sort of hollowware like cups and teapots and jugs, and the dipper would dip it in the glaze, shake it, and put it onto a grid to drain. The taker off would pick it up and put it onto a dryer, which was situated next to the actual dipping tub.
This is what they call the prestige piece, the masterpiece, and this is a petite Tokyo vase, and they look. I mean, the gilding on it is fantastic. The painting doesn't look much, but Having to put the colours on is a lot harder, and the shading, so they're not blocked. The gold is more impressive on these than anything else. We were all taught, we could have all done the gold on, but of course Pauline, I think, who did this one, had done gilding for many, many years, and they just look very impressive, very expensive. A clock, and I'm talking when I used to do my demonstrations in the early 90s, a lovely, like a large carriage clock in this was about £275 in Harrods. So I had a look when I was in, because I did it in Harrods, you see.
To make a mould, you take an article that's already made. It could be like that candlestick. If I was making a mould off that, I would make it in 2 halves. I would fill a block, they call it block and casing. I would make a case with wood. I would fill it with plaster. I would coat this with soft soap, and I would put half of it in the mould. The next day, I would take it out and I would do the other half in another case. You take the wooden sides off, and you've got two square blocks with the shape of the candlestick, 1 half and 1 half. Put them together, and you pour your slip in, and you've got your shape, whatever shape, whether it's a Dalton figure or whether it was that figure. That's how they're made. And we did the same with, it's a very, very skilled job, blocking and casing. I'd say it's the most skilled job in the sanitary ware industry. A block and case maker can command his own price anywhere. So he's got the article, and he makes a mould off that, and then he's got the 2 halves to make the toilet. Well, that's his master mould. Off those 2 sides, then he can make as many as he wants. Like I say, with any figure or any shape. There's got to be air holes in it, obviously, you know, and plaster sets off very quick. Gets very hot as well. Plaster sets off very quick. When the moulds are made and they're assembled, and we'll say a closet mould, toilet mould if you like, people call them toilets or WC, but it's a closet in the trade. Like I've explained earlier, it's in 4 parts: the rim, the 2 sides, and the slipper, the foot. When you've made, I mean, you imagine how many you've got to make if a caster is making about 30 a day and you've got 200 casters. And they're not all the same. I mean, all moulds differ. Some are in parts, some are in 3 or 4 different pieces you put together. Some have the rim that is stuck on, so the rim is cast separate in 2 separate parts again. And each mould has to be marked where you punch the holes. If you're putting a rim on a lot of what they call siphonic toilets, which is a silent flush toilet, the rim has got about 20 or 30 holes in it and 1 or 2 slots. All those are marked on the moulds. So when you lift your lid off, your moulds are sitting in the other part, and you punch all those holes and you cut the slots. Then you turn it over and you place it on top and you stick it on. You stick it on with slip, liquid slip, liquid clay, but very soft. And then when it's finished off, because you can't see the line, I could see it probably if I was looking for it on a toilet. I'd see where it was joined, or I can feel it, but the average person wouldn't spot it. Like I say, block and case making, very, very skilled job, because he's working backwards all the time. He's working opposite to what he's looking at. So it's a good trade if anybody's thinking of going into it. Be a block and case maker.
The first thing we had to do was to learn how to mix colour and to use a palette knife. And it was a bit like cement, you know, mixing cement, you know, how you had to make a little hole and mix. And when I went home at lunchtime, I was covered in this orange paint, this like dust of dry colour. And my right arm was dead through mixing all this colour. And I walked in and I said to Mum, I love it, I love it. And I hadn't touched a paintbrush then, but I don't know what it was, I just took to it straight away, yeah.
And you had this little stool, you used to have to put all the wear on you and knock there was 3 prongs on what they used to put in the kiln. Don't do that now. And these prongs used to stick on bottom of the ware. We used to have to knock them off. Put them on a knee and knock them off, and then stack them up. And then when you got enough, you used to have to go and put them on a stillage until and then piece of cardboard, and then piece of cardboard till you couldn't get any higher. And then they were wheeled away. And then it went to Royal Doughton. And that was better still because we had benches in. We had lighter work. It went on to the china then, where this was the earthenware, went on for china. And that was good because we got a bench set to, but we used to have to do 5,000 pieces a day. Yeah. And that's when the hard work did set in. Yeah. But at the end of the day, we were getting paid for it.
Casting was hard when I first started, and a lot of dust. Then eventually they had extractors, so you weren't getting the dust, which a lot of the men suffered with silicosis, you know, like the miners. The only difference is it was white dust instead of black, but it was a deadly thing. And when they retired, there wasn't many. I don't think there was any. They'd all got a percentage of silicosis, which they got a pension for. They tried to say all sorts of things, like government bodies do, that when you went for your medical, you used to go down Hill Street, Stoke. I was lucky, because I was there 22 years, so some of them had been there 40, 50 years, you know. And when they went down to Stoke, at first, they'd hold it off as long as they could. They'd say it was bronchitis or it was asthma. And the casters knew. I mean, they couldn't get the breath, some of them, you know, and they knew. And eventually, they got to a point where they'd have to start paying them. And it might be 25%, 50%, because they'd only got 50% lung capacity left. The rest was slip, because the dust had gone down, got mixed with mucus and solidified, and oh, it was a terrible disease. I know one man that I went to visit. He was ill with it, and I was surprised when I knocked at his door. He lived on Hartshill Main Road. I knocked at the door and noticed the door was open, and this voice said, "Come in," and he was lying by the door trying to get air. He was breathing in. It was terrible. He got oxygen, a cylinder inside, but he said, "I wanted to try and get some fresh air so I could breathe," you know. It was a terrible disease.
fire clay had got grog in it. Grog is, it can be about half as big as a grain of rice. It just crushed bricks. And that was incorporated with marl and other stuff, you know, to make a clay. So fire clay, because it was that thick, they put grog in that. And even when they started casting, fire clay had got to have grog in it, crushed bricks. You know, they crushed it as fine as about half the size of a grain of rice. So, yeah, it was thick stuff. I mean, the sinks, the fire clay sinks were about 1.5 inches thick. And there was a lot of weight in them. I spent most of my time, 37 years, in the closet shop. One shop, 37. And then they started to thin the sinks down. They're only just over 1 inch thick now. Probably for the weight and all that, you know, and the haulage of it, less weight. They just cut down on it. But at one time, the 24, 18, 10s and the 30s and the 48 sinks, they were 2 inches thick, solid fire clay. They were probably about 4 inches at the corners, you know. And it was real heavy stuff. I was just glad I wasn't on sinks, you know. And then there was a lot of pieces stick together on fire clay closets, even when they started casting. Hell of a lot of pieces to the mould. Nobody wanted to do fire clay closets. It was more straightforward doing the sinks. It was just 2 pieces to the mould. And they used to be finished about 2:30, and we got another 3.5 hours to do them, and on the same money. But you hadn't got that weight, you know. But it was a difficult job, fire clay closets.
We had to learn to do what they call brush strokes, just plain brush strokes on a white plate. And you would spend, well, until however long it took you to get one done properly. And then you learned how to do them that way, and leaves and ferns. But you were about 6 weeks just with a plain white plate and learning how to do different strokes. There were shaders, there were different sizes of shaders, very small and medium and large, different sizes of tracers. They would call them greeners. They were all different shapes and sizes. Palers, different shapes and sizes of palers. Square, round shaders. There was everything. Because you used a lot of colours on the pattern, and you needed a different brush really for each colour. So that, and you just learnt to recognise which brush, and you would usually have large pots full of brushes and all different size shapes of sticks and everything, knitting needles stuck up the end, and you know, because obviously they weren't fixed brushes, they were only on like a heavy plastic tube, and you had to get sticks to stick in them, and, yeah.
You faced what they call the silicosis panel. There was 2 or 3 doctors, and they asked you a lot of questions. and then you were examined and x-rayed, and it was the x-rays that showed up, you know. But at first, like I say, it seemed to take, all of a sudden you'd got 25%. Well, you don't all of a sudden, you've got 12% or 10%. So you don't all of a sudden, you don't go and they say you've got 25% after you've been going for months, well, for years, and they're saying you're clear. You've got a bit of bronchitis, but it's nothing, you know. And then you go, and when they were in the stages where they couldn't get the breath, and obviously they couldn't put it off any longer, so they'd say, oh, you've got 25 or you've got 28% or... And they used to come back to work and they used to say, told me I've got 28%. How long have I had 28%? How long have I had 10%? You know, but that's the way the board worked. I mean, they didn't want to pay out. That was top and bottom of it. It's supposed to be independent. But it was backed by the Potteries Managers Federation. So that leads you to think, you know, was there any collusion anywhere? I don't know. You couldn't prove it, but they started paying when you got to about 50 or 60%. Then you had to retire on a pension. It wasn't all that big. The pension wasn't, but at least you got something. And it was very hard to prove. I mean, you're going against a panel of doctors, and there's nobody backing you up unless you could afford. Nobody, I can't think of anybody that ever did, went private and tried to prove it that way. Because you didn't book the system in them days, or you might be out of a job.
I was nervous again with it being a new job. I'd never been in the pottery industry at all. But it worked out. I was foot grinding for 5 years. Foot grinding, they were mostly dishes, the big oval dishes, sandwich trays, the gravy boat stands. The bottoms are not level, so they grind. You have to put them on a grinder, flat grind, and grind them level, and take the glaze off the bottom. They had extractors taking most of it off, but it was noise again there. And you was in a confined space, and it was noisy when you was doing glassware. If you've got to grind the middle, there's a bulge. If you have a look in the meat dishes, they used to have a little bulge, and you had to grind that out level or get it reasonable. You lay it on a glass. There was a big block made up out of, I think it's like plaster, and this glass with reinforcing in was embedded in it, so it got to be level, and then you just laid it on the table.
Recently, I still suffered with a problem with my throat, a thing called pharyngitis, and it stemmed from standing by a dryer and sort of when you're placing the dipped ware onto the shelves in the dryer, you putting your head into warm air all the time and then bringing it out, and it gives you like it dries the back of your throat out, and I'm still have a problem with clearing my throat and things like that. I mean, I think I was fortunate because when I started, they just stopped using lead in the glaze. And if you look into the history of the pottery industry, dipping was an extremely hazardous occupation, because apparently it affected the brain. The lead in the glaze eventually affected the brain. And I believe just before I started, they used to give the actual dippers and their attendants a pint of milk a day to try and combat the actual lead in the glaze, you know. But one instance, I mean, you'd obviously got the dust, because when glaze dries on you, it goes to powder, and you're practically a walking dust machine, you know. And you're also standing in sort of damp all day, you know. You've got the wet from the glaze and the water. You're forever sort of having colds and chills and suffering from arthritis, you know, and things like that. You look at a dipper and he's always got something wrong with his fingers or something like that. It's a bit hazardous. It was an hazardous occupation.
We used to chew the ends of these plastic holders on the brushes to soften them, because if you tried to put them on a piece of wood, they would just split. So you would suck them. You'd be painting away and chewing these brushes, and when they were soft and pliable, then you would put them on your stick to stop them splitting.
Each part of the factory, they made what they call stuck-up stuff. Well, that was when you put your rim on separate. You put a plate inside. You put 2 wing plates in the side of the closet. You were on stuck-up stuff, and that was on the top floor of Garner Street, one of the top floors. All the stuck-up stuff was made there, and on the flat, as they called it, down at the bottom, because there was about 4 floors, but on the flat they made cisterns and pedestals, and they all had to be carried out, inspected. Then they went down to the kiln for spraying. They were sprayed and fired. Places used to, that was a pretty heavy job. In all places they used to place them on the carriages or the trucks as they went through. So everybody had a part, even the fellows that weren't popular, like the inspectors, you know, that used to send them back to you. It was all right sending them back while they were in clay. You could just sponge a little mark out, or sometimes you used to even sponge the pencil mark off and send it back, you know, and then they didn't spot it next time. But when they fetched you, they used to fetch you to do what they call rubbers. If they come off the kiln, fired, a first fire as they called, they were fired twice. They fired them once in biscuit, then they fired them in glaze. And if they come off in biscuit and there was a mark, they used to send you down to do it, and you had to do it with a stone, a rough stone, because it had been fired, it was hard. So it paid you really to make a good job in the beginning, because you could spend half an hour doing a rubber, and the foreman would look at it and say, "Oh, it's not good enough, you have to do some more." And you were thinking to yourself, "I've got to go back up, I've got to do such and such, I've got to run off, I've got to," and you're wasting time down there. So, you know, it didn't pay you to be a caster that didn't care much.
I went on to quality audit after. I'd been on the bench for a few years, and I was one of the older ones what were there, because they kept coming and leaving. So I was the older one, and they said, "Would you like to go on quality audit?" I said, "Well, like everything else, I'll give it a go." And I loved it. I know it was hard for my mates, who I'd been friends with for a while. But it was hard for them because I used to have to send their work back. But it was hard for me as well. But I'd get in trouble if I let it go. So I had to send it back when it was bad. I got called some names, but, you know, I had to do my job. I got more money and I had to do my job.
They put me on shower trays. Well, the moulds to them were spanny arms, you know what I mean? And they were about the heaviest thing in the earthenware stuff. But because I'd always been on fire clay, they said you can go on shower trays. And then after 2 or 3 years on shower trays, they put me on wash hand basins, which was lighter. It was like, it's called a battery. There's 100 in a big concertina. Imagine a big, massive concertina. It's nearly from here, halfway across that road, nearly to them houses, they are. And there's 100 wash hand basins in there. And the caster comes early morning and he fills that concertina full of slip. It's all tightly packed together, you know, nothing can, you get an occasional leak out of it, but he knows how to repair it, he knows how to stop it. He had a great big wheel, like a train wheel at the end, to make sure you'd got clamp them up that tight, you know, because you've got all that pressure in there. Anyway, by the time we got to work, they'd been in there, say, 2 hours. And he took a plug at the bottom, run all the surplus slip out, and it just left the shell of a wash hand basin, 1/4 of an inch. And you just got to get them 100 out then, pump your tap holes in, your chain hole, and and fettle them in general, which there wasn't much fettling to do, and there was no grog in it. It's just smooth, just like butter. So I ended up on a battery getting 100 wash hand basins out, and that was your day's work. I believe since I've left, the potter, whose ever battery it is, the potters are having to fill that themselves now. That's an additional extra, as the potters got to do without any extra money. So when you'd fettle them, you put them on trucks, and the next day you'd got check them all as they were all right before you put them in the dryers, and then you start getting your other ones out. But it was a good job to end up on.
We always use dried colour, always powder. And you put so much on your tile, make a little well and put so much terps in. This is the way of learning the consistency that you needed. And of course you didn't need too much terps, otherwise it would be too sloppy. So you'd mix it like firm. But the fat oil apparently is sort of the dregs of evaporated terps. And it's just like fat, you know, like an oil. And you put so much of that in. Now sometimes that could be very runny, so you have to be careful. Sometimes if it had been left, it could form a skin and go hard, you know. And you would have to learn how much to put in to make that colour viable to use. If you didn't put enough in, it wouldn't stay on the piece of ware. It would just fade off. And so that was the art, I suppose, of learning how to get it just right. And when you were shading, you'd got to get it sort of dark on one end and paling out, and you had to learn how to use the brush. And if your colour was too wet, of course you just got a solid band. And it was all in the, it was quite complicated, I suppose, really.
Now casters are clever in some ways. If they found somewhere that rained in, which it did, I mean, there were glass roofs and sometimes you'd get a drip, just a steady drip, you know. You see it on the floor and you'd think, oh, that's a good one, that is. When you got one with a crack in, you put it under there on your shelf. Albert, said the foreman, it's rained on this. He said, it's ruined it. Well, this Albert, chap with ginger hair, we called him the Red Fox. He'd say, yes, I've done it myself, George, you know. You couldn't fool Albert. He'd put it in the book, but you couldn't, he knew, you know. But the other foreman, who was a little pompous man, a bit like the captain in Dad's army, very similar. He was just the opposite, and he was very pompous and thought he knew it all, and he, oh, yes, I'll pay you for that, yes. He never queried because he didn't know, but Albert had been one of the lads and knew what he was doing, you know. Yeah, they did little things like that, they'd all got little tricks, and you're supposed to have a stock, and they checked your stock every week. If you're making 12 a day, you should have 60 around you for 5 days. Now, if you broke one, which, I mean, sometimes you could break one, putting it on the shelf, chip the foot, you know, because they were only in clay. And so what they used to do, this pompous foreman always did the checking. You wouldn't get away with it with the other one. He used to come around, and you put your number on your ware. So on the what they call the inlet, where your toilet seat screws down, the 2 holes, at the side of that is a number, and that's the caster's number. So you had to have your stock, and you kept your stock in a stove. All of you in the same stove, a big stove with steam pipes, drying it all off, you know. Well, he used to go down. He used to go down one side. Where are yours? And they'd say they're here. Right, 2 here. Okay, and he'd count them. Right, you've got 59. You've lost one. Yeah, okay, 59. Carry 59 out next week. Okay. Righto. He'd go to the next bloke, and you knew he'd probably lost 3. You see. So you'd keep. Joey's name was, you'd keep Joe talking, and that bloke had put 3 of yours on his or 3 of somebody else's, and he'd go down, he'd never check the numbers. and so this is the sort of thing they do, and you were going to get caught eventually because you were short on your stock, you know, but they didn't want to be that weak. So yeah, little tricks of the trade.
We spent about 9 months just generally doing old ware and stuff that wasn't really sold. Just learning how to do your paling and your shading, and then using different types of colours. Some colours could be just like using strawberry jam. It wouldn't spread properly at all. And then a coral one, it had to be what they call floated on. So it would be put on your brush, and you would literally have to blob it on and then sort of smooth it out. Others very, very sticky. Others very runny. But you know, that was the beauty of the trade, really. And we did that for several months, and then on a pattern plate, and then you did your pattern plate, which showed every different type of consistency of colour. And then once you'd done your pattern plate, you were allowed to go on, that was always on glaze, you were allowed to go on your biscuit then, the underglaze. And that's when the hard work starts, because it's very different. On a glossed plate, you can clean it off. On a biscuit plate, you can't. Once the colour's on, it's on. And you make a mistake, and it's there for all to see. But we did mostly underglaze wear.
And my dad always said he didn't want any of his kids on the pot bank, but that's where the money was. So we all went.
It was all pressed by clay. Everything, there was nothing at that time casted with liquid clay. I think they just introduced casting in the sinks. But there was quite a lot of big stuff, like urinals downstairs that are still made, pressed out of clay. So they give you a mould that's shaped, that when you filled it full of clay, it came out like a wedge, about 12 inches long, and you cut it in about 6 sections, because they're only about that wide. Cisterns creeping up a little bit now after about 18 months there. Cisterns, they were pressed out of clay. They give you 2 halves to a mould and a bottom to it, and give you the clay, and you just flatten the clay out on a plaster block with they called it in them days a batter, and it was made of fire clay at the top with plaster base on it like that, and you'd flatten a piece of clay on this plaster table, if you like, till it was about 1 inch thick, and you'd put your arms under it and put it in your mould, and then join your 2 sides to the bottom, and then you'd make a joint inside, and then when it come out of the mould the next day, you'd have verges to trim off where they joint, you know. There was a verge all round where it joined the bottom, and there was a verge at each end of the box, if you like. All that had got to be finished off and smoothed off. And then going from cisterns, went on to make press closets at 18. At the age of 18, I was pressing closets, yeah. And that was a bit of a difficult job. If you didn't build up to it, you couldn't do it straight away, you know. So I was the youngest presser in the area. There's only 3 of us living now. And we were the last firm to press closets by hand. And I was the youngest one of those 3 who were left. I was on them for about 8 years, and then they started to experiment with casting them with liquid clay. But for about 4 years I earned a living pressing fire clay closets.